Good morning all. We are now starting the third session of our course Media Training, promoting a positive image of migrants and recognizing their contribution to development in the SADC region. And as in the previous two sessions, we're going to have two parts today. And we have two of our experts you know already. They are Charles and Vincent. But today we have also with us two new people who are Makungu Baloi from ILO. She's a communications specialist from ILO. And we also have Carolina Rodriguez from Dilucidar, who is a consultant with many years of experience working for United Nations. So they are going to share a little bit of their knowledge and experience with you today. And for our first part of the session, we're going to approach the media as a stakeholder, partner, critic, and conscious, monitoring the impact of fair reporting. That's going to be the topic of our first part of today's session. And for facilitating this session, I would like to give the floor to Makungu, who is going to conduct you through this topic. So Makungu, welcome to our session today, and you have the floor.
Thank you, Fernando, and good morning to all our participants, and good morning to all our colleagues who will be giving presentations. Actually, we're swapping the sessions around. We're starting with module 5, which is reporting fairly and effectively in telling the migrant story. And then the media as a stakeholder and partner will be the second session, module 6, where Vincent and Charles will be taking over that session. So I'll be facilitating the session around reporting fairly and effectively when we're telling the migrant story. So just to first give a background of the session, in our participants, we have a number of media personnel ranging from journalists, reporters, to communications officers and communication specialists from the different ministries we work with, or the ministries that are responsible around issues of migration in the region, as well as some UN agencies also covering issues of migration. So our two experts for the session will be Carolina, who has a background in communication strategy and breaking down heavy content and development content around issues of migration and other vast issues around development within the UN system. And then we also have Charles.
She's such a pretty woman.
We also have Charles, who has been with us. I'm sure by now you're all familiar with Charles and his background. He gives a lot of perspective around journalists and how to cover those stories. Charles will specifically be looking at how to protect our sources when we are finding stories on reporting around issues of migration, and also what editorial process we can follow and how we can better influence our editors and our managers and our lines of reporting when we are pitching the stories. So before I take much of our time, as we are running on a tight schedule, I'll just firstly ask Charles, before coming to Carolina, to give us a brief introduction in terms of what are some of the key things that we should look out for when we are trying to influence policymakers or inform them around issues of migration, for them to be influenced around policy decisions and shaping those policy decisions from a perspective of journalists and as reporters of migration. Over to you, Charles.
Thank you very much, Makungu, and hi to everyone. Bonjour à tous. I think I'll be speaking in English because most of the participants speak English, but apologies to French-speaking participants. And as we've been saying since the beginning, don't hesitate to participate in the chat box, share some remarks, and ask any question you may have. I'll be going into what Makungu was suggesting, and in the interest of time, there's a lot of material that can help you make your way through these questions in a tool that is online. It's not yet specific to the SADC region. It's a tool that we developed with journalists and communication experts from different countries, but it's available in French and in English right now, and it's really a useful resource. What I'd like to do is basically show you around a little bit and tell you how you can answer some of the questions that Makungu was raising. I'll be sharing the link as well. I hope you can see my screen all right. It's called the Ilo Toolkit for Journalists. It's looking specifically at two important issues that are highly connected to labor migration, which is the question of forced labor on one side, which we could call when labor migration goes wrong in some instances. Forced labor isn't just about labor migration, but we know that migrant workers in particular are vulnerable to exploitation and in some instances to forced labor. And fair recruitment, on the other hand, is another very important issue within the body of work of the ILO, which is trying to make sure that labor migration goes right, looking more specifically at a key aspect of most of labor migration journey, which is the recruitment process. And the recruitment process is quite a complex one. It's not just the placement of a worker in a job position. It actually starts earlier and goes all the way to the moment when a migrant worker comes back to his country of origin. And when that process is unfair, migrant workers tend to have a negative experience. Just to tell you a little bit, this toolkit is organized in a modular approach. And the idea is to make sure that if you want to make impactful stories, and if you want, for example, to convince within your organization, whether it's a media organization or whether it's a civil society organization or any type of organization, and you need to convince people, editors, other members of your organization that story is important, we believe it's really key for you to understand the main challenges that we're talking about. I think Vincent's presentation yesterday was quite interesting in that regard, highlighting the different aspects of this issue. In this toolkit, you'll also be able to go maybe a little more in depth on some aspects of the policy issues that are at stake. Why is reporting on forced labor in the SADC region an important issue currently? Why is looking at the recruitment practices, how private employment agencies are behaving, how migrant workers can find themselves in some sort of a debt trap because they have to borrow money to be able to have a migration experience. All of that is something you'll find in this first section. You'll see it's very interactive. It's full of videos, of links, and I won't go into too much detail, but it's just to tell you that this is a resource that you can peruse and you can investigate, I would say, so as to really fully understand the topic. It's also quite detailed on the legal framework, which at times can be something that is difficult to capture or to have a global overview, especially over time, of how this global framework has been developing. It's quite specific, the legal framework to international labor standards, but these international labor standards are very important to understand how we manage labor migration collectively. And you will see that over time, especially since the end of the last century and the beginning of the 2000s, there has been an increase in the production of international instruments on these topics. So it's important for you to understand the story nicely. And then it's important for you to find interesting, compelling stories that resonate with the interest of your audience. In this resource, we share with you a number of story ideas, mostly through questions that you can ask yourselves and that are, I think, relevant in the context of any country within the SADC region, and more precisely, relevant in many regions within your countries. How are workers recruited? What work do they do? What's the journey that they make? What are the conditions they live in? And all of these questions are entry point to produce and identify interesting stories. And you'll see in this resource, there's a number of questions. There's maybe around 35 or 40 questions. And I'm more than convinced that if you go through these questions and you relate them and you connect them to the area of work that you are working on, which can be a capital city, it can be a border region, it can be a traditional region of departure or of arrival of migrant workers, you're going to find interesting stories related to migration, looking at the economic aspects, the legal aspects, the stories of discrimination as well. And that will help you produce interesting stories. One last comment, and I'll end it there right now, is how to get support as well. I think that's very important. Makungu was mentioning this. How do you get buy-in from your editors, from your leadership? And so here we give you a lot of advice. Journalists that have been able to produce stories, in some cases, which have had important impact in their countries or in their region, have shared with us some of the ideas that are interesting. We address important, evident questions such as funding, because producing such stories at times require to move. I think the COVID has had a positive impact in the sense that it's helped us understand that a lot of things can be done remotely, but still to have access to the stories, we need to be where stories are happening. And that often requires funding, equipment, also for the production at times of images. So I don't want to go into too much of the detail for the sake of time, but I just want you to be aware that this resource is here. It's here for you to use. I'll be most probably creating a little thread in the Academy forum so that we can discuss maybe, and I can show you some interesting resources within the toolkit. There's more than 150 links, so you won't have time to look at all of them. I might point out to some of them, but you'll see it'll give you a lot of interesting ideas how to collaborate with others. I think the magic of the SAMM project is to have this regional approach. And if we want to take the maximum benefit of it, it might be to have journalists from Lesotho and South Africa collaborating and working together on migration flows from both countries. That's very important. And in many instances, we've seen breaking reporting being done by journalists that had both perspective of a story and that had really advanced knowledge of the issues in both countries. We are talking about people who are on the move. And in many cases, the ones who are telling the stories only have one side of the story. And if we're able to encourage and to help the production of cross-border analysis with expertise that comes from both sides of the of the migration flow, I would say, that will be more than impactful. I think I'll be talking later about working with vulnerable sources, but yeah, that's it for now.
Thank you so much, Charles. That is very, very insightful. The tool that Charles is talking about will be available on the e-platform, and as Charles mentioned, that he will be available in the forum that we've created on the e-learning platform for you to engage him and ask further questions and go through the details of the media toolkit. And specifically, if you have questions that relate to maybe a story that you're currently pursuing, or you have an idea that you think you want to share with him, and while working through the toolkit as a guide, he will be very available to assist you in that. I will come back to Charles again, where we discuss issues around how to protect vulnerable sources, and also how to protect yourself when going into the field in terms of sourcing the stories, how to conduct yourself when you're conducting the interviews, issues around protection of both your source and also of the reporter as well. But I want to quickly head over to Carolina to also come in with the perspective of how to influence policymakers, or also how to influence even migrants and the general public in methods that break down the story from being something so complex, but to be something a bit more palatable, something that is easy to consume. I mean, now we're working in the digital era. Even newsrooms now are tapping into social media as an outlet for them to share stories, to break the latest breaking news, to share ideas, and to report on issues. So I want Carolina to come in with a perspective of how can we improve, or how can we better communicate and report on issues of migration from a visual perspective. Also, how do we then take big complex theories, big complex policies that all organizations are putting together into more palatable and easy to consume for both the migrant worker who is not does not have access to such information, and also to the general public who might also not be well vested in those information. I'll quickly head over to Carolina, but feel free to drop your questions in the chat if you have any questions for Charles or Carolina as the discussion goes forward. Carolina, over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Makungo. And first of all, it's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me. And I don't even know where to start. I am so passionate about this topic because it's something we work with every day. And I think that both from the journalistic perspective to the communications officers, there's always that challenge on how to really get the story out there. And when we're dealing with policy, and we're dealing with development issues, and we're dealing sometimes with topics that are hard to talk about, you always have that challenge at how do you capture the attention of the audience that you're chasing. So in my experience, I have a couple of good lessons learned that I would love to share with you. So when it comes to really learning, like exploring ways of unpacking the information and the topics in ways that are visually appealing or that can help tell the story, we had a really nice experience working in ECOWAS with their Convention on Social Security. Let me see if I can share my screen. We did a whole communication strategy there that had obviously internal. Are you seeing my screen right now?
Yes, we can, Carolina.
Do you see the ECOWAS thing, or are you seeing Legos?
ECOWAS, the communication
okay.
outreach. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, so in this example, we decided that we needed to create like a visual narrative with this whole campaign. So we took the visuals of migrant birds as a metaphor, and we used them to unpack the information of the convention. And when we had the convention, we started reading it, and of course it's a legal document that was very, very hard to digest. So the first thing we did, besides creating this identity of the project, unpacking how each, also, for the regular person, social protection doesn't necessarily mean anything. You need to unpack what kind of social protection was the convention covering. So we went through each one, trying to unpack how would the birds being a worker, when they're injured, when it's old age, when it's maternity benefits, we really unpacked it with these little birds. And on one hand, it made it was kind of cute. So everybody remembers it. People were not able to unsee the birds once they saw it. And it really made the content a lot more inviting. But we still had the issue that the text was like in legalese. So we created a popular version that was designed for people that, that need to know about that convention there. But this is like university people that have studied, people that work in hospital, people that work in trade unions, people that work at insurance companies. So they don't want to read the convention because it's really boring and difficult. But what we did was that we summarized it in a language that was a lot easier to unpack. And it would just give them the reference of, okay, these are the articles, this is what it's about, this is what you need to know about this. And that popular version was a lot more accessible. And we were really happy with that, but we realized this is not enough. This is not, we need to break it down to a much more digestible format. So we did an ultra popular version that was really more focused on addressing the migrants, like, is this for you? What does this mean to you? How does it affect your family? We're not talking about Article 1 or 2, we rewrote the whole convention and the issues, really trying to focus on how does this affect from a migrant's perspective. And all of these elements fell into a broader communication strategy that had a lot of different deliverables targeting different stakeholders, because we had several governments, we had ministries, we had the whole ecosystem around the ILO. So we tried to develop a toolkit that had a series of elements. I'll try to show you on, let me show you this, the live version. We developed a toolkit that would have all of these elements in a way that was also easy to use and a template for all of them. Give me 1 second. So this was one, do you see my screen? Wait, I guess, sorry. So and again, going back to staying realistic and not going, head over heels with the technology, we use Trello, which is a free online service where we could post all of this content with all of the visual assets, all the basic assets, how to use it, what kind of messaging, the different versions of the convention, visual material, content for social media for different partners to use. Even templates for PowerPoint, animations. And the idea was to have this collection of content that all the partners can use. But this was just the starting point, right? Like, that's like one thing that I wanted just to say, like, in terms of like, sometimes you need to unpack the information in a way that is, enticing and appealing. But I wanted to bring you to this other example, because I think, the birds are powerful and they were, and they're cute and they're nice, but often I think one of the big challenges that we all face today, and I wanted to like bring this issue, was also how do we use visuals in a way that is powerful. I don't know if you've seen this image, but recently it's been going viral on LinkedIn, and it's really interesting because in my company, we do a lot of infographics and we do a lot of data visualization. And sometimes you're working with numbers, you want to tell a story, maybe there's a number of migrants and going into one country, or you have data from a certain ministry or from sorry. So learning how to visualize the data is really effective in terms of engaging policymakers, because nobody has time, right? This is the thing, people don't have time. You need to be able to capture their attention super fast, because we're like visual creatures, and the way we digest and we process information visually just a lot faster. So when I was working with Kofi Annan a number of years ago, and he was on the West African Commission on Drugs, and we were working on these infographics. And one of the things that we did there that I was always, it just kind of like one thing led to another. We were doing an infographic that was showing the difference between different types of drugs that this was on drug policy. The infographic was basically, we had a table, and the table was showing, this is the assessment of these different types of drugs for based on the level of control they have, in terms of like, this is how forbidden they are by the law, but this is how dangerous they are assessed by independent experts. So the graphic is quite simple. It really just shows on the, I don't know if you can see on the left, level of harm, and on the right, the levels of control. and you kind of map what is the difference. So you see that drugs, for instance, are super under control, like, I don't know, like for example, Ritalin. It's hard, but maybe it's not so bad for your health. And alcohol in many places is, you know, you can just buy it off the shelf, but it's obviously creating a lot of health damage. And when I saw this in the Washington Post, you know, this was published in the Washington Post, where you have the debate, you know, really summed up with that infographic, and that really helps drive the conversation. And I felt that really helps engage policymakers, because it has that, you know, you have that hard data linked to a strong visual, and it ties it all together in a way that doesn't waste people's time. So I think that's also something that I wanted to share. And then I'd say, like, one of the last things that I discovered, which was again one of those learnings that happened, and it was a little bit in an unpredictable way. This was in the context of the World Cup when it took place in Africa. I don't know if you guys remember. Obviously, you have to remember. It was such a big deal. So one of the things that we were doing is we did this alternative guide for the World Cup, and this was a really interesting lesson learned, because learning to like piggyback and capture the moments of, you know, of moments that have the global attention has been super useful, at least when I've been trying to get policy issues on the radar. So what we did for this is that we decided we knew what teams were playing in the first round, because we had the map, the calendar for the first round, and we took every time an African team was playing another team, we found country stats, and so we changed the team statistics with development indicators, and then we kind of tried to find like where there were issues, where there was collaboration between the countries, and where things were not working out. You know, it could have to do with trade, it could have to do with foreign debt. We explored different narratives, and then we would try to develop a game plan for Africa. And so this was, and it even had like some stuff that, you know, elements of humor, you know, like what the countries were famous for. So it mixed a lot of hard and difficult to process data, but it told it in the storytelling around it was really fun, and it was opportunistic. And this was really popular with policymakers, because they would not forget it. They're like, oh my God, this World Cup guide was so fun and different. It was not the typical formatting for a policy document. I mean, the only complaint I got was that it didn't have enough about football. You know, it seemed very footballish, but it was all about development. So when it comes to, you know, addressing the complex issues, I would say focusing on the visual side of communications is super important. Being able to be playful and a little bit creative and pushing the boundaries on that front will also help you stand out, because you know, there's so much information and it's so cluttered. And then the other thing is being opportunistic in terms of like the timing and finding when is the right moment to tell this story, because again, it's full of fantastic stories out there, but you need to be able to find the right moment to tell it. So I'll leave it right there for now. And yeah, let's see where the conversation takes us.
Thank you so much, Carolina. That was very insightful. And as I mentioned before, I'll just ask the participants, if you have any questions from what Carolina and Charles have been sharing, you can drop in the chat if you have questions in terms of how to overcome some challenges that you might have faced yourself when trying to report on hard issues such as migration, sensitive topics that you think you struggled with navigating the reporting in a way that was fair and effective. You can drop your questions in the chat, and Charles and Carolina will be able to help you and answer those questions. But I want to still continue with the conversation that Carolina just was explaining now around the three things she said about having great visuals, being playful and creative, and also just taking being opportunistic and seeing opportunities of where you can collaborate, where you can tap into to share the stories that you have been collecting for a while. I want to come to issues around making of series. So a lot of, even some of our participants are radio journalists, you know, so they it's not only about just writing the story or writing the documents around those issues, but I wanted to bring in a perspective or just share a bit in terms of how we can better create series for television, for radio, around issues of migration, that it's not so heavy and it's not like, as she was saying, that the data is hard and can be very difficult to share or to elaborate on. But then how do you creatively make series around issues of migration that is both respectful and it's not harming or removing the rights of the migrants of whom we are telling the stories of, and it's also fair and just effective as a way of sharing their stories as well. So I know you have some experience in terms of doing some series both on TV and radio around such issues. So can you please share with us, Carolina? Thanks.
Oh, thanks for that. I mean, this kind of takes me to the conversation around, you know, like the narrative built around migration in general, right? And it's such a tricky subject in so many places, because there is that there's always a level of tension, and I think different countries have been able to manage this in different ways. I think if we can, again, if you're like a communications officer at the UN and you're dreaming big and you would love to be able to, you know, do a series, we often just don't have the budget to do it, right? So again, a big part of getting these stories out there is finding the right partnerships. So if there's a way of, for example, with working with journalists that have radio shows and like a podcast, you know, you could, I think it becomes a little bit more doable, but again, it has to really be ingrained in the local context, what is really making people tick. And again, showing the human side of things is extremely powerful. I think the other thing is also reaching out to the big fish, right? The big companies that are out there. I think I saw Sesame Street created a migrant character now in their as part of their ecosystem. They have I think they have a character that has like a learning disability or maybe a learning disability because they wanted to show inclusion. And now they've also created a migrant character. I think they're super powerful when you're, if you can, you know, partner with a children's series or with something that is already existing. In South America, there was a very interesting, there was always the national soap operas address social issues. There was always an issue that was like really like the hot topic. And the one season, it was a whole year of the soap operas would last 1 year. It had a big component of migration, and of course, but that's a big operation. So I think it depends on the access you have to different types of players out there. But the story, there's so many good stories out there. So it's really about luck, being opportunistic, finding the right people and the right vehicle. So I think the biggest way of getting this done is just like not being shy and going out and knocking on doors and getting somebody who will, you know, believe in their story and take it forward.
Thanks, Carolina. But let's say I'm a journalist and I work at a radio station and I have a show. I have maybe a primetime slot in my show. How then can you advise me, or what are the things that I can use to maybe create a series within my slot? So I'm not maybe a communications officer. I am a journalist. I do have access to podcast equipment. Maybe I already run a podcast, or maybe I work at a national radio station, but I want to share migration issues, but I want to share them in a different and enlightened way. What are some of the things that I can start thinking about or look out for or do to enhance or create that series within my show? So
my sense is that when you're talking about the issues of migration and refugees, and you want this, I mean, I think there's, again, who are we going to be talking to? If we're going to be doing a radio show and we want to recast the light under which people are looking at migrants and be maybe not so hostile, or you know, understand that they are, you know, people that are adding value to the community, and that there is, you know, data demonstrates that migrants in general add to the economy of the place they move to. You need to be dealing with that, you know, with that towards the general population. This is not necessarily the policymakers, but if you capture the audience, it'll affect the policymakers, right?
Yeah.
So I wouldn't start with migration as the main theme. I think people love fantastic stories, and there are fantastic stories of migrants, right? There are really tragic stories. There are stories of migrants that went and became successful business people. There are migrants that went off to have like successful careers in the arts. I would start with those stories of those stories of success that really stand out, and then let the migrant issue kind of be the afterthought. Like you could have like the stories of like, these are my 10 stories of success, and almost at the end say, guess what's all in common with all these different people? They were all migrants, right? I don't know if recently you saw this footballer from Afghanistan. She was an Afghan refugee, and she was from Afghan refugee. Her dad was killed by the Taliban, and she moved to Denmark, and now she's studying she's in medical school, and she's on the Danish national team. She's a professional footballer, and again, like her whole story is just the fact that she's going to medical school and she's on the national team is already great. But then you're like, oh my God, and she's a refugee, and her dad was killed by the Taliban. You add those components. I mean, I feel that you have, or Steve Jobs, right? His parents were migrants. That's like an afterthought. So I would definitely start with like these stories. People love these, the underdog stories, the rags to riches stories. All of those stories, people are naturally drawn to them, because these are stories that we are ingrained to, want to listen to the whole thing. So I would, if we could find like that narrative, that connection, and they could be very, very different. But then the common thread is these were all migrants, and they came and they made a difference. I think that could be a way of doing that.
Thank you so much, Caroline. I think it ties into what Charles yesterday also mentioned around creating both. It's creating all the stories, but in a way that also is trying to share a positive light around the contribution of migrants, but also not shying away from the difficult issues that arise around topics of migration. I would let Charles come in and also give an input on this before we continue. Over to you, Charles.
Thank you very much, Makungu. I wanted to follow up a little bit on Carolina's presentation, and because I think we're really at the heart of the main challenge that's in front of us collectively. We know we're in a time right now with information overload, and if we want to get our message through, we need to find stories which attract attention, because we are in a battle for attention. Unfortunately, what we've been observing in general with regards to what I would call migration reporting is that what has a tendency to go through the nets and the filters of information and content production, and which makes its way to the audience, is often what I was referring to yesterday as the more sensational stories. And here again, the easiest sensational story that can make its way through is kind of the either negative or dramatic story. The negative story often used for political gain. We are currently in a presidential campaign in my country, at the beginning of a presidential campaign. And yesterday we had 2 presidential debates, and migration was everywhere, just as a way to say, we've been through rough times, we've had COVID, we've had economic problems, we've had lockdown, but let us reassure you, everything is fine. Our only problem is immigration, because there is too many foreign people here. And if you're feeling that life is unusually unattractive right now, it's because of that situation. And at the same time, we have a discourse about the fact that if we hadn't had migrant workers during COVID, we would not have been able to have transportation, food processing, harvesting. I mean, our economy would have more or less collapsed because of those essential workers. And so I would tend to agree with what Carolina was saying. We need to fight for attention. We need to produce stories that surprise, attract, and interest readers. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge that the overwhelming majority of migrant workers do not have a sensational story to tell. Exactly the same way as the majority of the people within this training don't necessarily have a sensational story to tell, which does not mean that they do not have interesting individual stories that we can learn from and that we should be able to learn from. And so that's kind of the challenge here. And what I find interesting in the idea of projecting oneself in a series, or for example, in a regular radio program, is that you are not necessarily relying on hot news to produce content. You are saying, okay, let's try to have a weekly or a monthly time where we discuss about these issues. Sometime we'll have something very spectacular to talk about because a football player just won a very important competition and he has a refugee background. But another time, we won't have that sensational story, but we'll just maybe look back at ordinary contributions that make our societies work, and also ordinary stories of inclusion that don't necessarily single out migrants from within our societies, but show how our societies are a fabric made of migrants and non-migrants. And at the end of the day, the migration status isn't necessarily the most important aspect. So that's how I just wanted to come in the conversation.
Can I just build in a little bit to what Charles was saying? I mean, I think that I completely agree. The vast majority of the stories are not super sensational. I think they're great conversation starters, and they help push the conversation. But I think if we look at how to craft really good stories, they don't have to be necessarily super sensational, but they do need to strike a chord. They need to be emotional, right? And I think that is something that you can do with an ordinary story. An ordinary life it's filled with feelings and emotions. And when you manage to do that, it makes a big difference. I can't remember where I read this or saw this. They did an experiment with this NGO that was designing a brochure for fundraising. And the brochure on the cover had the name, we want to, help children. This is the money that we're trying to get. This is how, they had like the typical information of this NGO, please donate now. And they had like maybe an infographic on the cover. They made an experiment and they changed the infographic for a photo. And instead of saying, this is how much money we need, this is what we spend our money on, they put a picture of a little boy. They gave him a name. They said, like, if you give money, I get to go to school. And they tested it, and people just connected with the story of this kid. Like, you can't help it. This is because humans are wired for this. So the people that were tested with the brochure with the photo were more inclined to donate money than the ones who had all the hard facts. Because this is the thing, you remember your feelings, you remember how you feel, but you might forget the numbers. So you need to, I think, you can create fantastic stories if you bring in that emotional connection. And if you have a series, it doesn't necessarily have to be 100% about migration. Just keep it interesting. Keep it interesting. Talk about, prosperity and mix it up. And I think that would, that's, go back to like, what do humans tick with? So I would venture out and mixing it up with other stuff. If we have like the migration segment, it's going to be super boring. People are not going to listen to that over and over again. It has to be refreshed continuously with stuff that makes touches your fiber, your emotional fiber.
Thanks, Carolina, and thanks, Charles. I think what I take away is also mixing it into just the general fabric of society, that to not try and single each other out, but just to create stories that are collaborative and that show that as human beings, as people in a nation, in a community, for us to build and for us to develop, we sort of have to, you know, bring all the stories. They make a very beautiful mosaic when we all bring it together and share all these ideas. I think to wrap up this session, I'm not seeing any questions. For people who are always rushing us down to ask us a lot of questions as the media. You guys are too silent. But I will just, before we wrap up our first segment, I will just ask Charles to quickly give us some tips in terms of how to protect vulnerable sources. And also how to also protect the journalists, the safety of the reporters as well when they go out into sourcing the stories. Thank you, Charles.
Thank you, Makungu. I'll go back to the toolkit, because here again, there's much more than I could say in today's session. And I think we've been taking a lot of your time in the past sessions going over the expected schedule. So I'll try to be within our time. Several things. Earlier today, I presented you what we call the first two modules: understanding the story, finding the story. The second part of the toolkit, the second part of the website, is really what starts once you have a story in hand, and you either go on the ground to get the story, and this is where we'll be talking about sources and safety, and also how you can tell the story effectively. And just very, very quickly, I just want you to know that there is, within this telling the story module, there is a considering a series section, which really, really resonates with what we were talking about, and also share some examples of newspapers that have been quite through some interesting experiences in either setting up a series or at times setting up campaigns when they were working on very important issues such as trafficking, for example, and severe abuse, where usually a newspaper will not go into advocacy, but at times there is such a consensus around the gravity of the issue that a newspaper will engage in a campaign to fight for some abusive practices. And in those campaigns, there is a very interesting example from Malaysia about a student trafficking scheme where fake universities were basically handing out student visas to be able to have people come in the country and afterwards exploit them and ask them to repay their debt by working. And so the newspaper in this case, which is called Our Age, decided to do a campaign and go beyond the series and actually advocate. Just before this telling the story module, as you're seeing, it's quite easy to navigate within the toolkit. All of the icons are clickable, and you have here a little house on top to go back home when you need it. In the Getting the Story module, there is two interesting subsections. One is about safety, and it talks about safety on a number of different levels, safety and security. It talks about personal safety. It talks about mental health as well, which is part of keeping one's safe and in good condition. And stories about migration, especially those that tend to lean towards more dramatic experiences, can be quite emotionally difficult for journalists because you're exposed to, I would say, some of the most brutal examples of violation of human rights and desperate situations, which can lead all the way up to death. And so it's very important for journalists who feel motivated. Maybe some of you, the discussion, you feel, oh, this is really a topic I should engage in more strongly. It's important also to take care of your mental health, and also to be aware of some of the main aspects related to mental health, because taking care of yourself is also taking care of your sources. So in the safety and security section, we talk a lot about your safety, your security, and the safety and security of your sources. This whole section was actually developed with the International Federation of Journalists and uses a number of resources that they have developed. And Ernest Sagaga, who is the who leads the safety and security department at the International Federation of Journalists, shares some interesting insight, as well as some journalists from the ground. We also talk about digital security because we basically need to acknowledge that in some instances, not all, but we're talking about mixed migration flows. We could be talking about asylum seekers and refugees. We could be talking about victims or survivors of trafficking. These are very vulnerable or possibly very vulnerable sources of information. By definition, when you are a refugee, you have fled your country out of a threat for your personal safety, irrespective of why you have fled and what is that threat. It can be for religious regions, ethnic regions, political, sexual orientation. That threat, as a journalist, you should protect it. And digital security is important because you might have resources that are linked to that source. Sorry if there's some background noise. Lastly, there's a whole section about working with survivors and protecting them. So I won't go into too much detail, but just for you to know that in the toolkit, you have everything in this section.
That's super interesting. Can I jump in?
Yes, you can come in, Carolina.
I mean, to build in a little bit to what Charles was talking about, when he's taken us to this like space where, like that field reporter where you're in, dangerous situations. And I think that like investigative journalism plays a huge role, and it's really critical and it's very important. And if we have people here in the group that take on these stories and take that lead, that's fascinating. I think but I also think that we have, again, going back to how do we make this digestible for everyone? I was thinking about the whole constructive journalism. I don't know if you've heard about this. It's like a movement to really, it's not to make that the bad story and the tragedy, and like if it bleeds, it leads. It's really making sure that journalism is playing a constructive role in society. I'm sure everybody here is understands how how a free press helps with stability and democracy, and how important it is. Let me just share a screen, because I was thinking about this when we're talking about the negative light on migrants, right? We need to find a way to turn these stories into something positive. And when you go through constructive journalism, you kind of look for solutions. So you don't put the spotlight on the problem, and you're not just like unlocking something. But also, if you go into the world of labor practices, it's not just about saying, oh my God, these companies are all terrible, they're abusing their workers. There's an important role to play, an opportunity there to find the solutions. And I think here it's really critical that journalists work closely with the practitioners and the experts to know what are the solutions that they should try to put out there. So I think this is something where we start connecting, not just highlighting key issues, but also offering solutions, because that's something that is in your hands, as journalists. So I just wanted to add that element to the mix.
Thank you so much, Carolina and Charles. And I think it's going to be very helpful for our participants. They can have all this material. It's available on the platform. I saw Charles has already dropped the links in the chat of the media toolkit, which you can access all this information from safety in terms of reporting, how to find the story, how to source, the story, etc., etc. So I want to thank everyone for the session. I think we are done for module 5, and I'll hand over back to Fernando. I think we'll be able to take a 10-minute break, and then from the 10-minute break, then we will be able to come back for module 6, which Vincent is going to take us through. Over to you, Fernando.
Thank you very much, Makongo. Thank you also, Caroline and Charles, for your presentations and comments. I think it was a very informative session. And as Makongo said, so now we're going to have a 10-minute break. So now is 9:33. So we can come back at 9:45. Before that, I just would like to remind you about the chat box that you can still, if you have questions or comments to do regarding this first part of our session. So we still can post here in the chat box, and Makungo is going to be with us here for the whole session. So by the end of the session, if you have time, we could address those questions. So and with that, we can start the break and be back here at 9:45 Pretoria time. So now we are starting the second part of our session today with module 6. That's going to be about monitoring the impact of fair reporting, the media as a stakeholder, partner, critic, and conscious. And for this part of the session, we're going to have basically Charles and Vincent. So we have presentations for you, and as usually, we also have the chat box for questions, answers. So I would like to ask, I think Charles is starting, right?
Well, I think Vincent has prepared a presentation. I'll be going also through some elements of the toolkit which are specifically on these elements. But it might be, if you don't mind, Vincent, it might be better for you to start with your PowerPoint, and I'll just pick up on that.
Okay, perfect. So Vincent, you have the floor. I think you can share your PowerPoint, right?
Yes, I can certainly do that. Thanks very much, and a very good morning to everyone. I'm glad to be back with you. My presentation this morning will be relatively short. Miriam had asked me, this course is about positive reporting on issues of migration. And we know that migration is multidimensional, it is fairly complex, there are a lot of ideas, a lot of perceptions, a lot of views on the issue of migration. And it's important to understand what we refer to as the governance landscape. So when we think about the role of the media, and the title of the session has to do with the media as partner, as critic, and so on. But the media does not function in a vacuum. And so when we think about positive reporting, I think we need to be cautious that positive reporting does not mean that we ignore the diversity of viewpoints, that we ignore issues that are controversial and so on. And so it's important to understand who, in broader terms, who the stakeholders are. So Miriam asked me from a migration governance perspective to just go through the key stakeholders, the roles that they play, and then when we think about the role of the media, to situate it within that particular context. So I have 3 slides essentially that I want to talk about, and my focus is really on the first part of our discussion, which is about the media as a stakeholder and a partner in migration governance. So let me go through this quickly. So let's just think about who the different stakeholders are and the role that they play. And so when we're investigating stories, or when we're thinking of putting together, as we were discussing earlier, for example, a series of radio programs or a series of articles on issues of migration, it's important for us to understand who should we be talking to, where should we be getting the information from, who should we involve in actually participating in our programs or contributing to our articles in terms of information. But the second part of that is saying, when we talk to particular stakeholders, or when we talk to particular organizations and institutions, from what perspective are they talking to us? What is their role? What is their interest in migration? And so, of course, it's inevitable that the first stakeholder or the first partner in migration governance that we would be looking at would be states or governments. And so it's agreed, and I think I've done a lot of work in debating the role of different stakeholders in migration governance, and it's agreed that clearly states or governments are the key stakeholders. And so they are responsible effectively for developing and implementing migration-related policies, migration-related legislation, and regulating and managing migration. So in other words, when we try and balance, when we try and compare the roles of different stakeholders, we cannot get away from the fact that primarily states or governments are in control, right? They effectively design the policy, they determine what happens in relation to migration. Now, of course, they cannot do so in isolation. So migration policy and rules must be, in my view, must be developed in consultation with other stakeholders. But ultimately, governments will decide what that policy will look like, what those regulations will look like, and so on. So it's important that we understand that. But it gets a little complicated because we often think about government as homogeneous, as having a single viewpoint, as having an agreed policy, and so on. But we find, and this is what complicates the issue, that different government institutions or different state institutions, in fact, have very different approaches to the issue of migration. And in many cases, those approaches are quite conflicting. And there are lots of examples where you have one part of government saying or doing something in relation to migration, and you have a different part of government having exactly the opposite approach or a conflicting approach. And so, for example, you would have one or some parts of government departments or ministries really focusing on managing migration for development, and they want to have what we often talk about as a more positive approach to issues of migration, because they say migration is beneficial for development, and therefore our migration policy, our migration legislation and regulations need to facilitate the movement of migrants, and it needs to reflect our interest in managing migration in what's often called the national interest. However, a different part of government, so your law enforcement agencies will have security concerns. They will say, but actually, no, we are concerned about trafficking. We are concerned about trafficking in persons and trafficking in drugs and guns and so on. We are concerned about people violating the integrity of our borders. And so they would argue for a more restrictive approach to migration policy and migration management. And so media reporting must reflect these nuances. So even if as an individual journalist or as a media institution, you have a particular orientation towards migration, so your orientation might be more positive, it's important to reflect these nuances. If we don't, it can lead to a lot of confusion. It can lead to a lot of uncertainty. If we simply report one side or one particular point of view, we ignore the other point of view, it then comes out in some form or the other in the public domain, and it creates a lot of confusion, it creates a lot of difficulty, and it makes managing migration quite difficult. So we need to understand what the different approaches are within government, and it's important in engaging in fair and accurate and non-biased reporting that we actually reflect these different nuances. That doesn't mean that we are reporting in a neutral fashion. So I'm not suggesting let's be neutral here. It is important to advocate for a particular position and a more positive view of migration. And part of that comes out of the stories that we're telling. So we cannot make an argument in absence of evidence, but it doesn't mean that we only look for the positive stories. It's important, as we said yesterday and on Monday, it's important that we have a balanced approach. And part of this is to acknowledge that actually within the governance, within states, between different governments, ministries and departments, there are conflicting views about migration. At a slightly broader level, individual states also engage with each other in migration policy and governance. And so we have regional economic communities such as SADC and ECOWAS and so on. And we also at a much broader level have economic and political unions such as the African Union. And so on Monday, Gloria presented on a number of different frameworks and protocols which give us an indication of what the approach of different governments are, what the approach of states are individually and collectively to the issue of migration. And as I suggested on Monday, it's important that part of what media practitioners have to do is to popularize or at least make available the information and knowledge related to all the different frameworks and protocols and so on, including national policies and national legislation. So all of this is state-driven. This part of it is state-driven, and I think from my point of view, part of the role of the media here is to reflect not just what the policies and legislation and so on is, not to just make that known, but also to reflect the diversity and different approaches and to help people make sense of what it is that is going on. Very important and something that actually what we are busy with at the moment is an example of this is the role that intergovernmental organizations play in migration management and migration governance. So there are a lot of intergovernmental organizations that either directly or indirectly have projects and programs related to migration. And the manner in which they engage in this is usually to provide technical assistance or advice and support to governments to manage migration. And so some of the international organizations will have very specific mandates. So for example, the ILO deals with labor migration issues. The UNHCR will deal with refugees. UNODC will focus around issues of trafficking and so on. So SAMM, the project, the program that's organized this particular event, is a very good example of cooperation between governments and a range of intergovernmental organizations. And so it's important to understand the role that intergovernmental organizations play. In addition, intergovernmental organizations also provide a very useful source of information on global, regional, and national initiatives. So there are a lot of reports produced by intergovernmental organizations on migration-related issues. And for media practitioners, it's actually important to be familiar with some of the reports that are out there that provide statistics on migration, that provide case studies on migration, and that really give us insights into what is happening in the domain of migration management and so on. So I think this particular event that we have at the moment provides a good example of how media practitioners can engage with intergovernmental organizations to try and understand the migration landscape and get better information around that. Critically important as a source of information, as a reference point for contact with migrants and so on, are local NGOs. There are a lot of NGOs in different countries that either work directly with migrants, and this might include migrant associations, but the idea is that many of them have not just contact with migrants, but they can help us compile the stories. They can help us find interesting information about migration and what is happening. And so they also provide, local NGOs also often provide an alternative point of view with regard to migration policies and migration legislation. And so part of our balanced reporting here is not just to reflect the view of governments in terms of migration and migration policy, but also of civil society organizations, as we often call them. And here, of course, actual migrants themselves are critically important. So either if there's a migrant association, or if there's a local, for example, human rights organization that works with migrants, it's important to establish contact with them and get information about migrants very directly. I think it was on Monday or maybe yesterday, we put emphasis on telling the story of migrants and presenting the human face of migrants, and local NGOs can serve as a useful contact point for helping us understand some of the challenges, some of the complexities, and getting the stories directly from the people who are affected by this. One of the areas that, in terms of labor migration specifically, one of the areas that we need to look at and that we as media practitioners, we need to be engaging with is the role that trade unions play. Now we know that as part of the role, trade unions are involved in protecting workers. So they advocate on behalf of workers. And it's important that we also recognize the role of trade unions in protecting the rights of migrant workers. So they can help us understand whether in fact we see inconsistencies in labor market policies. That can help us understand the extent to which migrant workers are protected. And this can be done in both countries of origin and countries of destination. So trade unions can actually give us really good insight into what's happening with migrant workers specifically. And so if we know, for example, when we're looking at issues of fair recruitment, when we're looking at issues of migrant access to social protection, when we're looking at working conditions for migrant workers, trade unions provide an important access point to get that kind of information. And they can help us think. Carolina earlier was saying that we need to come up with solutions as well, not just indicate what the problems are. Trade unions can help us think about how we can better protect migrant workers in the workplace. And of course, the counterpart of that is the private sector, right? And so a lot of the debate about migrants taking jobs, migrants displacing local workers and so on, private sector can actually help us understand this better, because within specific economic sectors, they have, we hope, they would have a good understanding of the labor market dynamics. They would have a good understanding of the impact of migration on the labor market in specific sectors, whether it is in agriculture, whether it is in construction, and so on. And so it helps us, again, develop the nuance about the impact of migration on the labor market. And so the private sector, in my view, has made an important contribution in helping us understand what our migration policy should look like, specifically in relation to labor migration. And then academic and research institutions. There are a lot of organizations within the SADC region involved in some form of research, some form of analysis around issues of migration. And so again, a lot of reports based on research that have been published. The problem is, or at least I think part of the problem is that a lot of these reports are quite lengthy, they're quite academic, they use terminology that people may not be familiar with. And again, consistent with what we were discussing earlier, it would be helpful for media practitioners to actually help ordinary people understand the contents of these reports. And the reason why that's important, research reports, academic evidence, and so on, can actually help us think about what we know about migration, what the trends are, what the patterns are. So it gives us an analysis and a better understanding of migration. And this is incredibly useful for migration policy and programs. And so the extent to which media practitioners can help us understand the migration landscape, what we know about migration, it will also help us understand what we need to do in terms of our migration policies and programs. Someone yesterday asked the question about where do we get access to migration statistics and so on. And so a lot of intergovernmental organizations will have that information, but there are also a lot of research reports produced by academic institutions and organizations that are available in the public domain. And I think it's important, if we want to have a broader understanding and a broader insight into what's happening in terms of migration, that for one, we access those reports, but two, and in some ways more importantly, we try and make those reports more publicly accessible and more digestible for people. And so here, and I will conclude with this point that you see in bold at the bottom, that as media professionals, I'm not a media professional, but I include myself as part of you, we need to engage with the variety of stakeholders. Of course, there are more than the 6 that I've listed. There may be a variety of organizations and institutions that may not be directly involved in migration policy and management, but could have an impact on it. But it's important that we engage with the stakeholders, because if we do not reflect the complexities, if we do not reflect the nuances and the diversity of views, if we go from one extreme to the other. So, for example, if there's the perception that media reporting on migration has been overwhelmingly negative, we don't want to run the risk of becoming overwhelmingly positive. And so we do need to balance what it is that we say when we report on migration. And the purpose of this is, one, we need to facilitate public knowledge. We want people to understand what is happening in terms of migration. And importantly, we also want to influence the public discourse. And that means we're not simply reporting on what's out there, we're also reporting it in a particular way. So while it's important to be balanced, while it's important to be fair, while it's important to be accurate, we also have to think very carefully about how we are influencing the public discourse, as we said the other day, through the language we use, through the kind of stories that we choose to tell. And so it's really about, as reflected in the title of this particular session, it's really about being the conscience of society in terms of migration. But the conscience is multidimensional. It is not just a single viewpoint that we're trying to reflect. So I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Vincent. I think we had a problem here with your PowerPoint. We got blocked in the first slide. But I think your explanation was very, very clear. So, and I just would like to tell participants that your PowerPoint is also available on eCampus. So if they want to, after to go there and to have a look and review all your points, they're going to be there. But actually, your presentation was perfect, and I think it was very, very clear for all participants. So that was why I didn't interrupt you. So, now I give the floor to Charles, who is going to, I guess, I'm not sure if you have also a presentation or if you're going only to comment on Vincent's.
Thank you, Fernando, and thank you, Vincent, for the presentation. Yeah, I'd like to comment. I wanted to also refer you to some elements you can find on the online toolkit. Like this, we will have done a full visit of the toolkit, just an overview, but it's true that some of the elements of what Vincent was talking about are featured in the toolkit. And I just wanted to follow up a little bit on what Vincent was saying. If we're looking, I think the purpose of this discussion here, give me 1 second, someone is ringing at the door, I'll just check.
So meanwhile, maybe Makung, would you like to make any comment on Vincent's presentation? Oh, we have Charles.
Apologies, sorry for that. Sorry for being interrupted. Yes, no, what I wanted to say is I think if we want to produce impactful stories, we have to keep what Vincent was saying in mind. We cannot look to try and present a distorted version of reality. And we have to make sure, and I'm saying this more specifically for the journalists in the room, that we keep our possible bias outside of what we are producing. What's important is to provide factual, documented information and pluralistic sources of information, and to reflect maybe the diversity of opinions that may exist in a society. To do that, however, we have to be as informed as possible. That's what's important. What we tend to observe currently is that because journalists, in some instances, lack of specific knowledge on some aspects of migration, and we have seen how migration can be complex in the SADC region, they tend to be dominated by their sources of information. As I was telling you, we don't speak every day about migration in every country, but it happens that we're currently going through a political campaign in my country, and this is a time when we speak a lot about migration. And I'll give you one example that strikes me and where I think that journalists have a very important role to play. Yesterday in a debate, a representative from our government made this claim about refugees, saying, oh, we're very happy about what we're doing because we accept half as less refugees as our neighbor country, Germany, half as less claims. And there was no journalist in the room at that moment to basically raise the question, which is to say, is it positive for a country to accept half as less claim as the next country? That's not the spirit of the Geneva Convention of 1951. A well-documented journalist reporting on migration or refugee issues would have responded to the ministry by saying, we should not be looking at a specific percentage of acceptance of asylum claims. What we should be striving for is to be in accordance with the Geneva Convention, which is to accept every claim of asylum and give the refugee status to any individual that respects the Geneva Convention. But this is a striking example of a political representative using migration as a political weapon, basically to try and say to the citizens, there will be less foreign people coming into the country because we will not be taking asylum claims. But that is going in contradiction with the international agreements that his own state has signed and should be following. So what I mean by that is that bias of journalists should not be in the reporting. However, factual analysis, especially grounded on legal instruments and legal obligations of different stakeholders, is very important. Trafficking is another very good example. In many countries, we see that the way the media reports on trafficking is that victims, or what they prefer to be called survivors or trafficking, are often scapegoated because they are perceived as people who have engaged in some sort of criminal behavior. That comes from a lack of understanding of what trafficking actually is and what those vulnerable sources of information have gone through and how, as media professionals, we should present them. This is why in the toolkit, and I'll conclude with that, we've been going through the different sections. In the getting the story section, in the sources part, I referred you earlier to working with survivors, but there's also some material about working with other sources, support groups, advocacy, academics. That part of the toolkit will be quite in line with what Vincent was talking about, the different type of expertise you can reach out to, the role of trade unions, these type of ideas. But here at the end, and this is where I wanted to conclude, there is a part of the toolkit that we call following up. And what we do here is we basically discuss what happens after the reporting is done. How can we measure impact, but also the importance of possibly, I would say, yes, specializing in migration reporting. Awards obviously play a critical role because they can help a journalist raise his or her profile and become a respected, voice in a society. And therefore that leads you to specializing and being recognized as a specialized reporter or communicator on migration. Why is that important? It's also important because at the beginning with Carolina, we were talking about how you can find stories, how you can find impactful and significant stories. That's important when you're trying to raise your profile. But when you become in a media landscape recognized as a trusted source of information, impactful stories come directly to you, because people who want to get a story out will be looking for your support because they know you are a credible and trusted source of information when it comes to reporting on migration or migration-related issues. And I think that's what we would also want to encourage some of you to do, maybe not everyone here in the room, but to say, maybe if you feel that what we've been discussing about since the beginning of this week resonates with some of your values of what you think is important, it is worth spending some time and trying to yes, to specialize, I would say, or to raise your level of understanding of these issues. And by doing so, journalists will have a lesser tendency to be dominated in the public debate by sources of information, but they will be able to reach out to different sources of information to inform their audiences. And I think that's where the critical part is.
Okay, thank you very much, Charles. I see we have one question here. Actually, it's a comment in the chat box, so I'm going to read it for you. That's from the comment is from Ashok Bihari from Mauritius. So in Mauritius, there are many advocates of migrant workers' rights, in particular trade unions. But the general perception of the population on migrant workers is more negative than positive for some reasons, some of which may be understandable, others undoubtedly due to misinformation. The predicament for journalists is how to report in a fair and reasonable manner without being taxed or being either pro or anti-migrant workers. So it was more a comment. I just would like to ask if any of you would
I'd like
to
react quickly. I'd like to react quickly. I think, Ashok, that's, I mean, it perfectly in line with what both Vincent and I were saying. And it's really the challenge right now, not only on migration, but on a number of issues. Are we seeing currently in public debate a high polarization, and I would say a divide, and I think maybe one of the best illustration of that has been following the debate in the American societies over the past couple of years. The idea that there is basically two parts of societies that look at the same issue and that have almost two media spaces talking to them, each media space considering the other to be some sort of fake news or illegitimate or whatever, and huge polarization around basically the idea that you have to be pro or you have to be anti-migrant. And it's very disturbing, and it's true that it's quite a challenge right now for journalists to find the good track on which to walk, so as not to be perceived as being biased, because this is only fueling the divide that we are seeing in our societies, and we're observing this divide on migration issues absolutely all around the world currently. And in many instances, that divide is not informed by a lot of factual analysis. It's as you're saying, partly due to misinformation. But it's really critical for journalists to be as informed as possible, and that's why I think it's when Vincent highlights the fact that it's important to tell positive stories, but not to focus exclusively on part of the story is very important. I don't know if Vincent, if you'd like to comment as well, but I think Ashok's comment is really, the heart of the challenge. And it's not because you're saying this, Ashok, that the answer is simple in terms of behavior and what we have to do. It's actually quite complex.
Yes, if I may. I mean, I think it's an interesting example, Ashok. What you're raising is a case of people attacking the messenger as opposed to focusing on the message. And I'll give you an example of this. Some years ago, I was asked to write an op-ed on South Africa's migration policy. There was a process of it being developed. So I was asked, would I write my opinion and comment on the policy? So I did. I mean, I took the time of basically analyzing and pointed out where I thought there were positive things in the migration policy and where there were negative things. Overwhelmingly, I was quite negative about what was in the policy, which I was expressing my opinion. The advisor to the minister at the time responded to my article by attacking me, by saying things like, this guy has no idea what he's talking about. He just loves migrants and he wants to undermine, you know, the development of the country by encouraging more migration. He didn't say a word about anything that I'd actually said in the content of my article, right? So the attack was on me and who I was, and his conclusion was I wasn't a suitable person to be reflecting on migration policy. And so I responded and I said, well, I hear what you have to say about me as a person, but what are your views on the issues that I raised? And I think, and this goes to what Charles is saying, is the debate is often so polarized. People have such set views that when we produce alternative information or when we express an alternative viewpoint, they don't actually listen or take seriously what it is that we're saying, right? Their focus is more on what their particular point of view is. And so it can be quite difficult sometimes to actually engage in a sensible discussion in trying to get people to think differently. And so it does present a huge challenge, right? And so the question is, are we willing to be accused of being pro-migrant when in fact all we're doing is reporting facts, is we're reporting in a non-biased manner? And now I want to use the example from the forum. Someone from Botswana gave an example of Eritrean footballers who after a match applied for asylum and they didn't want to go home. And the response was that they should be deported. Now, you can finish the story there, right? And if you finish the story there, the impression that the public is left with is, who are these Eritrean footballers? Why are they causing trouble? Why don't they go back home? But if you add to that story, however, the Geneva Convention says that anyone has the right to apply for asylum and the case has to be heard, it actually puts a very different perspective on that story. So no longer do we see the Eritrean footballers as troublemakers who refuse to go home, but we actually see them from a legal perspective that they have the right to apply for asylum. Of course, you're going to be attacked for taking the sides of the Eritrean footballers or wanting to make things easy for them. But that is inherent, I would think, in telling stories, not just about migration, but in telling any story. Here in South Africa, recently, there's been a lot of journalists reporting on incidents of corruption, and then they get accused of being anti-government or anti-this politician and so on and so on. But should that stop us from actually telling those stories? Because it's important that the information is put out in the public domain. And I would conclude by saying, we have to ask, are we willing to actually be labeled anti-migrant or pro-migrant or whatever the label may be in the interests of pursuing fairness, in the interests of pursuing balanced reporting, and in the interests of reflecting a diversity of viewpoints?
Thank you very much, Vincent and Charles. And so we're getting at the end of our session today. And I just would like to take a few minutes to let Makungu to give us some information about the sessions that we're going to have next week. So next week we have 3 sessions on Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday. So, they are going to be actually open discussions. So Makungu is going to explain us more in detail what's going to happen next week in those 3 sessions. Makungu, you have the floor.
Thank you, Fernando, and thank you to Vincent and Charles for that session. It was very informative. And I like the last comment from Mr. G that says it is very important for journalists to now take on that role as a partner, you know, in the project and as a partner in migration, to start educating the population and the communities around those issues. As Fernando has rightfully said, that next week we are having 3 sessions. The first one is on Monday, the 27th, and then Wednesday and Thursday. Next week's sessions would be led by the different agencies. So Vincent did mention in his presentation that the structure of the SAMM project is made up of 4 agencies, ILO, IOM, UNODC, and UNHCR. So the different agencies will be running the sessions, giving us more in-depth into some of the key components of the project and some of the thematic areas which were already mentioned in the opening sessions by Gloria. But just to quickly give an overview of how next week will run. So we will, as part of the SAMM project, we are planning on having media campaigns that we are launching in 2020. So far we are starting to prepare for the 4 media campaigns that will be launching in 2020. The first one is raising awareness on the protection of migrant workers in the SADC region. The second one is promoting the portability of social security rights for migrant workers in SADC. The third one is promoting a positive image of migrants and recognizing their contribution to development in the SADC region, which is which is part of some of the discussions we've been having throughout this course. And the last one, it is the rights and responsibilities of persons of concern. So as part of preparing for this media campaigns, which we're gonna be launching next year, we wanna take you on the journey with us in terms of identifying some key messages and having some discussions and open debates around some of the key messages around these issues. So the first one would be on migrant workers, which will be run by the International Labour Organization, which is ILO, and the International Organization for Migration, which is IOM. And then the second one will be addressing irregular migration and trafficking in persons and smuggling of migrants, which will be led by UNODC. And then the last one will be having discussions around persons of concern and identifying some key messages that we want to be able to start using for the media campaigns around persons of concern, which will be led by UNHCR. So the structure would be mainly the organization that is leading the sessions will give a short presentation around some of their key areas that they're working on around these issues I've mentioned, give some key terminology. So for example, we always use persons of concern, but not everyone knows who are persons of concern. So they will go into details in terms of who falls under persons of concern, which is mainly asylum seekers, refugees, internally displaced persons, stateless persons, etc. So we'll have those discussions, presentations first by the agencies, and then we'll open the floor to discussions. Next week, we want to have more discussions and more engagement with you as our participants in terms of identifying some key messages that we can start driving in the media and that we can start pushing as we start preparing for our media campaigns that are going to be coming up next year. So I'm looking forward, hoping everyone joins next week and is ready. There are already some materials and some glossaries on the e-learning platform that we've shared that covers issues around trafficking, smuggling of migrants, stateless persons, internally displaced persons, migrant workers, etc., that you can start reading and preparing yourselves in terms of having that knowledge as we prepare for the sessions that will be taking place next week. So I'm very excited and looking forward to seeing every one of you and engaging with you on these issues. Thank you so much. Over to you, Fernando.
Thank you very much, Makungu. And with that, I'd like to thank all speakers from today's session, and also again to thank our interpreters. See you all on next Monday at 8:30. And I wish you a very nice end of day and a very good weekend. So bye-bye and see you on Monday.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.